Story number 1. Of all the unsolved cases I've researched, the Texas killing fields haunt me the most. I first learned about it while doing research for my criminology thesis, and something about this case dug into my mind and wouldn't let go. Maybe it's because I grew up in Texas, or maybe it's the sheer scale of unanswered questions. But I find myself coming back to it again and again, looking for answers that never seem to come. The bare facts are chilling enough. Over 30 bodies discovered in a desolate stretch of land along Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. The victims were found in an area that became known as the Texas Killing Fields, a fitting name for a place that has swallowed so many secrets. But what truly unsettles me isn't just the number of victims. It's how the whole thing was discovered. The police weren't conducting some massive manhunt or following a killer's trail. They were just investigating what they thought was a single shallow grave, one body in an area known for illegal dumping. It was pure chance that led to the bigger discovery. A K-9 unit was on scene, doing what should have been a routine search of the surrounding area when the dogs started picking up scents. Not just one or two, but multiple locations. Each new alert revealed another victim, another life ended in those fields. The more I dig into this case, the more disturbing details I uncover. Only 3 people have ever been convicted in connection with these murders, and 2 of them died before they could confess or provide any real answers. The third conviction barely scratches the surface of the total number of victims. It's like looking at the tip of an iceberg, knowing there's so much more hidden beneath the surface. What keeps me up at night is the knowledge that there are probably many more bodies out there. The area where the bodies were found is notoriously unstable, a mixture of marshland and shifting soil that makes it impossible to bring in heavy equipment for a thorough excavation. Every time I think about that, I imagine all the evidence, all the answers, all the closure for families, just sitting there, tantalizingly out of reach. The theories about what really happened in those fields range from terrifying to almost unbelievable. Some investigators believe it was the work of a serial killer syndicate, multiple killers using the same dumping ground over years or even decades. Others whisper about the possibility of a police inside job, pointing to the fact that the bodies were dumped in an area that would be familiar to law enforcement, but relatively unknown to outsiders. I've spent countless hours going through old case files and newspaper articles, trying to piece together a coherent timeline. But the more I learn, the more questions I have. The victims span different ages and backgrounds. The methods of murder vary. The only consistent thread is the location. Those fields became a grave for so many lost souls. What disturbs me most is the methodical nature of it all. This wasn't a case of random violence or crimes of passion. The killers, and I believe there had to be multiple, chose this location deliberately. They knew the soil conditions would make excavation nearly impossible. They knew the remote location would minimize witnesses. They knew exactly what they were doing. Sometimes I find myself driving past that stretch of I-45, and I can't help but slow down and look at those fields. They look so ordinary in the daylight, just another patch of Texas scrubland. But knowing what lies beneath the surface changes everything. I think about all the families still waiting for answers, all the cases that remain open, all the killers who might still be walking free. The case has 3 convictions on paper, but anyone who studied it knows that's just a fraction of the truth. It's the unsolved majority that haunts me. The possibility that some of the perpetrators might still be out there, maybe even still adding to their count. The fields don't give up their secrets easily, and that's exactly what the killers were counting on. In 2012, another body was found in those fields. They brought in the forensics team, marked off the area with yellow tape, and went through all the same motions I'd read about from discoveries in the 70s and 80s. Same location, same type of shallow grave, same lack of concrete evidence. Standing there watching the investigators work, it hit me. This wasn't just an old cold case. This system, whatever it was, had been operating continuously for decades. While we'd been studying old case files and postulating theories, they'd never actually stopped. 3 convictions and 30 bodies, and here was another victim being pulled from the same ground. Somewhere out there, the real architects of the Texas killing fields were still free, still operating, and we weren't any closer to understanding the true scope of what they'd done. Story number 2. What captivates me about the Majorana case isn't just that a brilliant physicist disappeared without a trace. It's the unsettling overlap between his theoretical work and the circumstances of his vanishing. In 1938, Ettore Majorana was at the height of his scientific career at the University of Naples. His work on quantum mechanics was revolutionary, particularly his theory about particle symmetry and what we now call the Majorana fermion. What's chilling is how his theoretical work about particles that could be their own antiparticles, essentially existing in two states simultaneously, seemed to prefigure his own inexplicable disappearance. The sequence of events leading up to his vanishing is what first drew me into this case. On March 25, 1938, Majorana took a boat from Naples to Palermo. Nothing unusual about the trip. He'd left a note for his family saying he'd be back soon. But then he sent a telegram from Palermo to his colleague Antonio Corelli that read, "Don't be alarmed if you get another telegram from me." Sure enough, the next day Corelli received a letter supposedly posted from Naples, saying Majorana had decided to return home and to disregard his previous message. Here's where it gets strange. No one ever saw Majorana disembark in Naples. The letter to Corelli was dated before his departure, meaning he'd planned this sequence of communications in advance. He'd also withdrawn all his money from his bank account right before leaving. The more you look at the details, the more it becomes clear that whatever happened wasn't a simple disappearance. It was meticulously planned. The contents of his workspace tell an equally unsettling story. In the days before his disappearance, Majorana had been writing extensively in his research journals. These weren't just ordinary scientific notes. They contained increasingly cryptic references to multiple realities and quantum states of consciousness. One passage that particularly haunts me reads, "The boundary between theoretical possibility and physical reality is thinner than we imagine." Remember, this was written by one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of his time, someone whose other predictions about quantum mechanics have since been proven correct. What sets this case apart from other mysterious disappearances is Majorana's scientific stature. Enrico Fermi, who worked with him, called Majorana a genius of Isaac Newton's caliber. This wasn't some eccentric outsider making wild claims. This was someone who had repeatedly demonstrated an almost uncanny ability to see deeper into the nature of reality than his contemporaries. His theories about neutrinos and particle physics were so far ahead of their time that we're only now beginning to verify some of them experimentally. The investigation into his disappearance was extensive, but ultimately futile. The Italian police traced his movements to that boat journey, but found nothing concrete after that. What's striking is how many different theories emerged, each seemingly as plausible as the next. Some believed he'd committed suicide, though no body was ever found. Others suggested he'd retreated to a monastery, unable to cope with the implications of his work as Italy moved closer to building atomic weapons. There were even reported sightings of him in Argentina years later, though none were ever confirmed. What keeps drawing me back to this case is how it seems to exist at the intersection of scientific genius and inexplicable mystery. Majorana's work dealt with particles that could exist in multiple states simultaneously, with the strange behavior of matter at the quantum level, with transformations that defied classical physics. Then he himself seemed to execute a disappearance that defied classical explanation. The timing is significant too. This happened just as physics was revealing the extraordinary possibilities of quantum mechanics, just as our understanding of reality itself was being fundamentally challenged. Majorana's last known writings suggest he might have glimpsed something in his theoretical work that disturbed him deeply. A colleague later recalled him saying, "In the quantum world, the distinction between theory and reality becomes dangerously thin." Most unsettling are the details in his personal diary from the weeks before his disappearance. Among equations and scientific notes were increasingly frequent references to parallel states of existence and the illusion of singular reality. One of his last entries reads, "What we call impossible is only what we haven't yet learned to achieve." Coming from someone of his scientific caliber, these writings take on a different weight than typical philosophical musings. I've studied many cases of missing persons, but none quite like this. Most disappearances can be explained by mundane if tragic circumstances: suicide, foul play, intentional vanishing. But here was someone who had demonstrated an extraordinary understanding of the universe's deeper workings, who was writing about multiple realities and quantum states of consciousness, and who then vanished in a way that seems to bridge the gap between his theoretical work and physical reality. Story number 3. Every time someone claims to have spotted Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, I find myself going back through the timeline of events leading up to April 2011. The methodical precision of it all is what disturbs me most. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden break. It was a careful orchestration that began months before anyone realized something was wrong. In early 2011, Xavier started taking shooting lessons at a local rifle club in Nantes, France. He didn't just show up occasionally, he practiced religiously, working specifically with a .22 caliber rifle. At the time, it probably seemed like nothing more than a new hobby. Looking back, it's chilling how he mastered the exact weapon that would later be used on his family. The financial movement started next. One by one, he began closing bank accounts and settling affairs. He purchased large quantities of cement and lime, materials that would later be used to bury his family under their own terrace. Each purchase, each transaction, each step was calculated. He even took the time to post cryptic messages on internet forums, as if leaving breadcrumbs for investigators to follow. What haunts me are the letters. In the weeks before the murders, Xavier sent strange, detailed messages to relatives and friends. "Don't try to contact us," he wrote, explaining that the family was moving to Australia for a witness protection program. He crafted an elaborate story about drug cartels and undercover operations. The letters weren't rushed or desperate. They were carefully composed, designed to buy him time before anyone would think to look for his family. Then came the murders themselves. Agnes, his wife of many years, and their 4 children, Arthur, Thomas, Anne, and Benoit, were each killed with 2 shots to the head while they slept, executed with the precision he'd practiced at the shooting range. The oldest was 20, the youngest just 13. He drugged them first using sleeping pills mixed into their evening drinks. Even in this ultimate act of violence, there was calculation, not chaos. The bodies weren't discovered for weeks. Xavier had wrapped each family member in sleeping bags, buried them under the terrace, and covered them with quicklime and cement, materials he'd purchased well in advance. He'd even taken the time to place religious icons with each body, a detail that suggests either deep delusion or a twisted attempt at ritual. The leading theory is that financial ruin drove him to this point. Xavier had been maintaining a facade of aristocratic wealth for years, but in reality, he was drowning in debt. His business ventures had failed, and he'd been living off credit cards and loans. Rather than face the shame of his family discovering their lifestyle was built on lies, investigators believe he chose to eliminate them entirely. What makes this case uniquely disturbing is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. After the murders, Xavier was seen driving south through France in his Citroën C5. Security cameras caught him withdrawing money from an ATM in Roquebrune-sur-Argent in the Var region. Then, on April 15, 2011, he walked into a budget hotel carrying a backpack and simply vanished. The last confirmed image of him shows a man walking away from the hotel, looking no different from any other middle-aged traveler. Since then, there have been sightings across the globe, in South America, Southeast Asia, even back in France. Each report sparks a new investigation, but none have led anywhere concrete. It's as if he studied how to disappear as methodically as he planned everything else. What's often overlooked in this case is how Xavier's aristocratic background played into both the crime and the investigation. The de Ligonnès family was old French nobility, and Xavier had been raised with an overwhelming sense of family pride and appearance. This context makes his financial failures even more significant. He wasn't just facing bankruptcy, he was facing the destruction of centuries of perceived status. In his mind, perhaps the ultimate shame wasn't the murders themselves, but the possibility of his children learning they weren't really aristocratic elites. The investigation continues today, with each new sighting triggering a fresh wave of police activity. In 2015, police dug up a church after receiving an anonymous letter claiming Xavier was buried there. In 2019, They dramatically arrested a man in Glasgow based on fingerprint evidence, only to release him hours later. Most recently, monks at a French monastery reported seeing someone matching his description attending services. These constant near misses and false leads suggest either incredible luck or, more disturbingly, that Xavier's meticulous planning extended far beyond the murders themselves. He would have needed resources, connections, and an extraordinary understanding of how to evade modern surveillance. The fact that he's managed to remain hidden in an age of ubiquitous cameras and digital tracking is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Story number 4. As a research chemist, I spend countless hours sifting through scientific literature. Most papers blur together after a while. Variations on known processes, incremental improvements in yield or purity. But there's one paper from 2017 that I can't forget. Not because of what it contained, but because of how it disappeared. I first encountered it during a routine literature review. The abstract seemed innocuous enough. Waste recycling chemistry, nothing unusual in our field. The introduction discussed standard molecular decomposition pathways and recovery methods. It wasn't until I reached the experimental section that I realized what I was actually reading. The waste they were processing wasn't industrial byproduct or municipal sewage. They were describing a novel method for breaking down human cadavers into reusable chemical components. The methodology was meticulously detailed. Initial dissolution in concentrated sodium hydroxide, followed by a series of extraction and purification steps. As a chemist, I could appreciate the technical elegance of their process. As a human being, I felt increasingly uneasy about the implications. The paper included yield data, optimization parameters, and even scale-up considerations. The authors had clearly done extensive testing, which raised questions I didn't want to contemplate about their source material. Their discussion section focused entirely on efficiency metrics and potential applications, without a single mention of the ethical implications. When COVID-19 hit in 2020, I thought about that paper again. We had a new intern starting in the lab, and I wanted to show them this as an example of how seemingly benign chemistry can have profound ethical implications. But when I went to pull up the paper, it had vanished. Not just the PDF I'd saved. Every trace of it was gone from the scientific databases. The author's other publications, their institutional affiliations, everything had been scrubbed clean. Confused, I reached out to colleagues who I remembered discussing the paper with. Most had only vague recollections, but one, a visiting researcher from China, provided a disturbing explanation. Oh yes, the CCP does this sometimes. When they find research they want to develop internally, they remove all public traces of it. It happens more often than you'd think. The timing is what haunts me. The paper disappeared just before COVID began overwhelming healthcare systems worldwide. I found myself thinking about the process they described. Efficient, scalable, and completely untraceable once completed. During the height of the pandemic, when crematoriums in certain regions were reportedly running 24/7, I couldn't help but wonder if that vanished paper had found a practical application. The scientific part of my brain tries to rationalize it. Molecular recycling is just chemistry. Atoms don't care if they came from a tree, a plastic bottle, or a human body. The process they described was actually quite innovative from a purely technical standpoint. But I can't shake the feeling that I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. A glimpse behind a curtain that was quickly drawn closed. The broader implications extend beyond just this single paper. As a chemist, I know how research builds upon itself. Techniques get refined, processes get optimized, applications expand. When I think about that original process being developed in secret for years, potentially being integrated into large-scale operations during crisis periods, it makes me look at other research disappearances differently. Last year, I noticed another paper vanish, this one about rapid tissue dissolution using novel catalysts. Before it disappeared, I noticed the authors had cited some of the same obscure references as the 2017 paper. It could be coincidence, but in chemistry, citation patterns often reveal hidden connections between research groups. I've started keeping a log of papers that suddenly disappear, especially ones dealing with biological material processing. The pattern isn't clear yet, but something is definitely happening in this corner of chemical research. What really keeps me awake some nights is knowing that somewhere, in labs I'll never see, this research continues. Chemistry doesn't just vanish. It evolves, adapts, finds new applications. And while I can't prove anything definitively, I know that what I saw in 2017 was just the beginning of something much larger and more systematic than a single disturbing paper. Story number 5. Of all the broadcast intrusions I've studied, nothing quite captures the perfect mix of technical sophistication and chaotic weirdness like the Max Headroom incident. It happened on November 22, 1987 in Chicago. I was working late at a local TV station that night, though not at either of the stations that got hit. What makes this case so fascinating isn't just what happened, but how it revealed the vulnerable underbelly of our broadcast systems. The first hijack hit during WGN's 9 p.m. newscast. I remember watching it live. One moment, sports anchor Dan Roan was talking about the Bears game. The next, the screen went black. When the picture came back, there was this figure wearing a Max Headroom mask, swaying back and forth in front of a rotating metal panel that mimicked the computer-generated background from the real Max Headroom show. The audio was just this harsh, buzzing sound. It lasted 17 seconds before WGN's engineers managed to regain control by switching frequencies. But that was just the warm-up. The main event came about 2 hours later, around 11:20 p.m., when the same hijacker took over WTTW, Chicago's PBS station. This time, they had audio, and that's when things got truly bizarre. The figure launched into this rambling, distorted monologue that mixed pop culture references with seemingly personal grudges. They mocked WGN as world's greatest nerds, took shots at Chuck Swirsky, a WGN sportscaster, and made references to New Coke, which was significant because the real Max Headroom character had been doing Coca-Cola commercials. What fascinates me as someone who worked in broadcasting is the technical expertise this required. In 1987, hijacking a broadcast signal wasn't something you could do from your basement with a laptop. You needed serious equipment and knowledge. The hijackers had to overpower the station's signals at their broadcast towers, one at the John Hancock Center, the other at the Sears Tower. This meant they needed to be somewhere with line of sight to both towers and have enough broadcasting power to override professional transmitters. The WTTW intrusion went on for about 90 seconds. And this is where it got really weird. The figure started humming the theme from Clutch Cargo, an old animated show, made references to their brother's dirty gloves, and then things took a turn for the bizarre. The camera pulled back to reveal a woman in what looked like a French-made costume, wielding a fly swatter. The Max Headroom figure bent over, exposed their rear end, and got spanked while crying out, "They're coming to get me!" What's particularly unsettling is that WTTW couldn't stop it. They had no engineers on duty at their broadcast tower that late at night. The staff at the main studio could only watch helplessly as their signal was hijacked. When it finally ended, it was only because the hijackers chose to stop. The investigation that followed revealed just how vulnerable our broadcast systems were. The FCC got involved immediately, but despite the severity of the crime, it carried potential penalties of up to $100,000 in fines and a year in prison. They never caught the perpetrators. The leading theories pointed to either disgruntled ex-employees who knew the technical infrastructure or members of Chicago's underground hacker scene. I've spent years piecing together details about this case, talking to engineers who worked at both stations and others in the Chicago broadcast community. What emerges is a picture of a meticulously planned operation that required at least 3 people: someone to wear the mask, someone to operate the camera, and someone to handle the technical side of the signal hijacking. They needed expensive equipment, technical expertise, and intimate knowledge of Chicago's broadcast infrastructure. What's often overlooked is the timing of it all. Max Headroom was the perfect choice for a hack like this. The character itself represented a dystopian future where media corporations controlled everything. The real Max Headroom show had been canceled earlier that year, but the character was still being used to sell Coca-Cola. There was something almost poetic about using this corporate mascot to expose the vulnerabilities in corporate broadcasting. The aftermath changed television broadcasting in Chicago. Stations upgraded their security protocols, added encryption to their studio-to-transmitter links, and made sure they had engineers on site 24/7. But by then, the hijackers had made their point. They'd exposed how vulnerable these powerful media institutions really were. To this day, nobody has ever claimed responsibility. The statute of limitations ran out in 1992, so they could come forward now without fear of prosecution, but they haven't. Maybe they enjoyed creating a mystery that would never be solved. Maybe they're still out there, watching as their hack gets referenced in discussions of media piracy and cyberpunk culture. What really stays with me is the mix of sophistication and absurdity. These people had the technical skills to pull off something that would be nearly impossible today, and they used that ability to create 2 minutes of bizarre, almost surreal content. They could have broadcast any message they wanted: political statements, demands, threats. Instead, they gave us a piece of performance art that still defies explanation decades later. Story number 6, Isdal Woman case stands apart to me because of the elaborate performance she put on in the months leading to her death in that remote Norwegian valley. On November 29, 1970, a professor and his 2 daughters were hiking through Isdalen, Ice Valley, though locals called it Death Valley due to its history of suicides. They found a partially burned body, positioned in a way that didn't make sense. She was lying on her front, her hands raised in what investigators would later describe as a boxing position, a defensive stance suggesting she may have been alive when the fire started. But it's what the police found during their investigation that turns this from a tragic death into something far more enigmatic. In 2 suitcases at Bergen railway station, they discovered an entire collection of carefully curated identities: 8 false passports, wigs for different disguises, clothing with every label meticulously removed, multiple pairs of glasses, and perhaps most tellingly, currency from 9 different European countries. The woman had been traveling across Norway, checking into hotels under various aliases. She spoke multiple languages: English, German, French, but witnesses reported her accents seemed to shift, never quite matching the nationality she claimed. She signed hotel registers as Fenella Lorch, or Claudia Tielt, or Elizabeth Lienhauer, among other names. Each identity was crafted with attention to detail, but none of them were real. What haunts me about this case is the pattern of her behavior in the weeks before her death. Hotel staff reported she would frequently change rooms, claiming she couldn't sleep because of noise, always requesting rooms with a balcony or easy escape route. She was seen dining with multiple men who were never identified. One witness described seeing her being followed by 2 men in black coats who seemed to make her nervous. The forensic evidence only deepens the mystery. The autopsy revealed she had taken up to 50 sleeping pills, yet she still managed to make her way to that remote valley. Her fingerprints had been sanded off. Her neck showed signs of bruising, and while the fire had burned her face beyond recognition, it hadn't destroyed evidence of her sophisticated lifestyle. Her dental work was expensive and distinctive, suggesting she came from wealth or had access to significant resources. The police investigation revealed a pattern of travel that made no logical sense. She would check into one hotel, then move to another in the same city for no apparent reason. She'd take trains to small towns, stay for 2 days, then leave without any obvious purpose to her visits. In one hotel, she was seen writing in code in a small notebook, which was never found. What strikes me as particularly unsettling is how she seemed to be both hiding and waiting for something. She would sit for hours in hotel lobbies, watching people come and go. She ordered room service but often didn't eat it. She made phone calls that lasted only seconds. Everything about her behavior suggested someone who was either running from something or preparing for something, or possibly both. The political context of 1970 adds another layer to the mystery. This was during the height of the Cold War, and Norway was strategically positioned between East and West. Some investigators have suggested she might have been a spy. Her travel patterns coincided with several military installations, and her methods of concealment matched known espionage techniques of the time. Most disturbing is the recent discovery that some of her movements coincided with a series of top-secret nuclear tests in Norway. In 2018, isotope analysis of her teeth revealed she likely spent her early years in Germany's Black Forest region and later moved around Europe extensively. Journalists investigating the case found witnesses who remembered her taking extensive notes near sensitive military installations. Several of her hotel stays overlapped with testing dates at Norway's nuclear research facilities. The surviving physical evidence is equally unsettling. Her suitcase contained coded entries in a small notebook, with specific dates and locations marked. Some of these aligned with weapons testing schedules that weren't public knowledge at the time. A retired intelligence officer recently came forward suggesting she matched the description of a known operative, but conveniently couldn't remember the name or organization. In 2023, several more witnesses emerged with memories of seeing her in Oslo, always in the company of different men in suits. One hotel clerk recalled her frantically burning papers in her room sink the night before she checked out. Recent DNA analysis has suggested she might have been of European descent, possibly German or French, but her true identity remains unknown. What we do know is that someone went to extraordinary lengths to erase this woman's existence. Every item she possessed was carefully selected to reveal nothing while suggesting everything. Her clothing was high quality but untraceable, her accessories expensive but anonymous. The case remains open in Norway, and every few years new theories emerge. Was she a spy who knew too much? A criminal on the run? A victim of international trafficking? Each possibility seems both plausible and somehow insufficient to explain the elaborate performance of her final months. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.